This morning we're going to continue in chapter 3 of the book of Ruth, and just to recap real quick where we've been, if you haven't been with us, or I know trying to remember back sometimes 2 weeks to chapter 1 can be challenging. And that chapter 1 generally focused on loss and depression. Chapter 2 focused on adjusting to change and having hope for the future. And now we move to chapter 3. This is the love story portion of the book of Ruth. And oftentimes, a love story is defined by the circumstances surrounding the love. What I mean by that, take for example an old classic movie, black and white movie, Casablanca. I don't know if anyone here has ever seen it, but it was from the 1940s. Generally speaking, the idea is it's about a love story where what they call it the one that got away, where two people had been in a relationship together and it just didn't work out. They broke up, and then later on they reconnect and find out that, oh, I really missed a good thing back then. That's basically the situation, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, playing the parts of Rick and Ilsa. And so what happens in the movie is that the character played by Ingrid Bergman, she and her husband just so happened to travel to the nation of Morocco, a town called Casablanca, Morocco, hence the name of the movie. And they show up at this nightclub in Casablanca. And just so happens that that nightclub is owned by Humphrey Bogart, her former love. Well, that's where Humphrey Bogart says this iconic line. He says, "Of all the gin joints and all the towns and all the worlds, she walks into mine." He's talking about what are the odds of this happening, us reconciling and coming back to see each other again. And that heightens the sense of loss that this story plays against the backdrop of World War II still going on. You have great loss in war, and so it's a great movie because it shows us the personal loss against this much greater loss as well. And so the characters Ilsa and her husband, they show up just at the right time to see this man that she had previously had a relationship with. It's very similar to this book of Ruth, where Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, they show up at the right time, in the right place in Bethlehem. And so that's after Naomi had moved to Bethlehem, or moved from Bethlehem to Moab, I should say. We already said over the last 2 weeks how over a 10-year period, the three men in the family died. That was Naomi's husband and her two sons-in-law, leaving the three women. Well, Naomi and Ruth make the way back to Bethlehem, and once they get back, Ruth has to go to work in the fields in order to survive, and just so happens that she meets up with a man named Boaz. He's the landowner, he is rich, he's wealthy, and he has an eye, he notices her. He has an eye on her from the beginning. And sort of if you think of that as a ancient version of Casablanca, maybe Boaz would say something like, "Of all the barley fields and all the towns and all the world, she walks into mine." Well, today we'll look at this love story portion of the book of Ruth, and it's a story that you don't expect to be coming when you read it from the beginning. And very similar to Casablanca. We'll get into that a little later as well. And the thing is, when we compare it to a fairly more recent movie, I know that movie seems ancient to some of us, but that movie was out a little over 80 years ago. We can still relate to it. We can understand the language and the customs and all that. The book of Ruth is a little different because that was more like maybe 3,200 years ago. Some of the customs going on back then are completely foreign to us, so we have to do a little digging to figure out exactly and what was going on to understand it. So we'll go to Ruth chapter 3 now. We'll read the third chapter, which is 18 verses long, I believe, and beginning in verse 1. It says, "One day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do.' 'I will do whatever you say,' Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. 'Who are you?' he asked. 'I am your servant Ruth,' she said. 'Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer.' 'The Lord bless you, my daughter,' he replied. 'This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good. Let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning.' So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, 'Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor.' He also said, 'Bring me a shawl, the shawl you are wearing, and hold it out.' When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, 'How did it go, my daughter?' Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, 'He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, "Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed." Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and the hearing of his holy word. So last week, I briefly introduced that concept of the kinsman redeemer. It's foreign to us. We don't do that here in 21st century America, but I need to expand on it just a bit to give us a better understanding. The kinsman redeemer was a close relative of the deceased, and it was a person who had to be willing and able to purchase the family's debt, thus redeeming the property. The closest relative gets first dibs to marry the widow. And typically it would be a brother of the deceased man. And it was really expected that they would do that. In this case, there must not have been any brothers of Elimelech left, or else they would have gone to them. And the benefit of this is to keep the property in the family. That way they don't lose it. It doesn't go to the rich creditor, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. God is helping out the common people through this law that he established. What I find very interesting, though, is in the unique situation with Ruth. In the Jewish culture, Ruth, the woman, was in the driver's seat, as they say. It was her choice if she wanted to pursue this or not. She could have said, if she would have been much older, and if her husband would have died, she could have said, I'm okay just living out the rest of my life as a widow. Ruth is younger. She thought, if I find the right guy, I'd want to get married. But if she wants to, she needs to then approach the man and ask him basically to marry her. In this case, Naomi Her husband died, he had the land. Well, Naomi was older. She just didn't want to, remarry again. So the land would again then go to Elimelech's son. Well, the son, he's dead, so then his widow has the choice, and his widow happens to be Ruth. And so Naomi knew the Jewish culture. Remember, Ruth doesn't know much about these things at all. She's from Moab. She's a pagan woman who finally, found God in a sense and became a Jewish person by conversion. But she doesn't know a lot of these details like Naomi does. So Naomi takes her under her wing and she says, this is what you need to do. And she guides her every step of the way. For one thing, she prepares Ruth to go and have this encounter with Boaz, because she knows that if she wants to sort of win Boaz, she needs to show that she is worthy wife material. To this point, all that he has seen in her is being in her dirty work clothes, nothing very flattering. She's all sweaty in the middle of the day. I'm sure her hair's not done up right, all those kind of things, not very flattering. So Naomi tells her that she needs to, first of all, put on your best clothes, get a nice dress, put some perfume on, you want to smell nice too. Obvious things like that. Think back to when you were in high school maybe, and if you ask one of your classmates out on a date, whether it's a girl or a boy, during school you see them in one area of their life. They are wearing certain clothes then, they act a certain way. But if you want more of a close relationship with that person, when you go to, if he comes to pick you up or the guys you go to pick her up, you're going to dress a little nicer. You might shower beforehand as opposed to afterwards. You might put some extra, deodorant on, cologne, perfume, all that. Because you want to make a good first impression. That's what Naomi is telling Ruth here. He says, show him that you clean up well and that you will be a good wife. And so Boaz, he's in a good mood. The harvest had just been completed. And so they had a little celebration there. They're still at what they call the threshing floor there. They're at the work site. He's tired. He says, I'm going to turn in for the night. So while he is asleep and it is dark, that's when Ruth makes her move. She goes to him. She lays down at his feet. And then in the middle of the night, he wakes up. He says, why is a woman here? I didn't go to bed with a woman here, but there's one now. What's going on? And she explains. She says who she is, and she says this to him. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. She says, this is what I want you to do, and this is why. To us, we're thinking, what's going on here? This is clear as mud to us. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, this is the most significant line in the whole book of Ruth. She is saying, I want you to marry me here, because that would have been a symbol of him accepting her proposal. He then covers her with his cloak, garment, whatever you call it, as acceptance. If he says no, he would not do that, and then she would have to go on her way. From that point, we don't hear from Ruth anymore. Boaz takes it from there. And what I find very interesting, and this is not a coincidence, but this is how it was supposed to be. Boaz already had the plan in mind. He was waiting for Ruth to do this. Would it be tonight? Would it be tomorrow? The next day? Next week? Next month? He was waiting and hoping she would ask him to be kinsman redeemer, to pop the question, as they say nowadays. And so he automatically knows. He says, yes, I will do it if I'm legally allowed to, because he already did his research. He did his homework, and he knew there is someone in town who outranks me. We got to deal with that guy in the morning first. But if he says no, then I will, believe me, I will be your husband. And when he says, if he wants to redeem good, let him redeem. When I read that, I think, yeah, right, Boaz. I mean, come on, who are you trying to kid? He's saying the right words, but if that other man says, yep, I'll do it, do you know how heartbroken both of them would be? And Boaz knows it too. He would be so heartbroken he could not marry Ruth, and Ruth would be heartbroken because she can't marry him. I can't move on from this, though, without mentioning something that sadly has been distorted by some people throughout the years, and it bears mentioning here just really in passing. You might come across somebody who repeats this, or if you can find everything on Google nowadays, and if you type in these things, you'll find all sorts of stuff. Some things legitimate, some things a lot less legitimate. There are some people out there who try to read between the lines, and they try to read all sorts of improper things went on that night between Ruth and Boaz. Absolutely nothing of the sort is mentioned or even implied. When we read the Bible, if there's something improper, it tells us. It tells us about David and Bathsheba, tells us about Lot and his daughters. It tells us a lot of the details that we probably really don't want to know. There's nothing of the sort here. They did nothing inappropriate together, and that's another lesson for us, that Boaz was so concerned not only about being pure and remaining pure, but even having the perception in the community of being pure, because that could have disastrous consequences over what would happen the very next day. Of course, we haven't gotten there yet. And so we can't always control what other people think. We know that some people are going to make up their minds no matter what. But just imagine if someone saw them wake up together, what do they automatically think? Oh, wow, Boaz and Ruth, they're not married. And things weren't like they are now in that regard either. We'll leave it like that. We can't control what people think, but we can limit the amount of ammunition that they have to turn back towards us. That's what Boaz did. He made sure that he was out of there, Ruth was out of there, while it was still dark, before sun came up and nobody saw, because there was nothing to see anyway. And so we know that, again, when some people hear a juicy story, they already made up their minds, and what would happen if word got back to them, hey, someone saw you two there. They say, well, yeah, we were, but nothing happened. Who's going to believe that? Obviously, they're going to think that, oh, you're just, lying, covering it up, and so forth. Their purity is another layer to this great love story that we have in Ruth chapter 3. This is a man and a woman brought together by God's providence and nothing else. And but there's still one person that stands in the way, and that would be addressed first thing in the morning. We'll look at that next week and see how that all shakes out. But for now, the reader can't help but think that as we're reading chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, things are starting to get better. There's one obstacle left. You have to think, if this is really ordained by God, He's going to find out a way to make this happen, despite this one potential person being in the way. In our modern day, we use all sorts of romantic expressions. We say, oh, we were destined to be together. Or you read, Shakespeare back in school, Romeo and Juliet, they're star-crossed lovers. And those images, they make us feel warm inside. And, oh, this is a great story, and I love that movie and everything. Because it was brought together by chance or fate. I talked about that the other week too. But nobody ever talks about two people who were brought together by the hand of God. When you consider that God determined that the love between these two people would serve His purposes well beyond their lifetimes as well. To me, that is what makes this the greatest love story ever. God's providence, God's hand on both of these individuals. Moving to Naomi, the first 2 chapters, which is the first half of the book, she's the main character. Her name appears more than any of the others. Now she takes a back seat. And this shows us a little bit about how she has changed and grown through what has happened. While all of this is going on between Ruth and Boaz that night, I suspect she didn't get a wink of sleep. She's excited. She's like, this is so close, and I'm so happy for Ruth, and this can change my life and her life and everyone's life here. She did everything she could. She guided Ruth. She went back to Bethlehem. She did everything, but we often come to a point in our lives, it's out of our hands. We can't do anymore. It's like raising children. You can do it for so long, but once they leave, then they have to make their decisions themselves. In this situation, there was nothing more that Naomi could do, so she had to put her trust in God. And when it says in verse 16, when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" That's the official record, and I'm sure that's what she said. But basically what she's saying is, are you engaged yet? You know how women can be. It's exciting. Are you engaged? She probably said, I didn't even sleep last night. Tell me everything. And then Ruth goes and I'm sure joyously relives every detail, how romantic it was and all those kind of things. I know I'm reading into it a little bit here, but it's a really great portion of scripture that we're looking at. And look at how their fortune has changed. They were destitute, in poverty, not even sure if they were going to survive. And now they are so close to having their dreams come true. One domino left to fall. That's this man in the morning, this other potential kinsman redeemer. But she told Ruth, wait until you find out what happens, for the man, that is Boaz, will not rest until this is settled today. We have Naomi now. Look at the change. In the very beginning, she was not willing to wait through the famine in Bethlehem. She had to go over to Moab and leave God's country and go elsewhere. And then until she found out there was food back in Bethlehem and then it came back, she was so impatient then. And now she's encouraging Ruth, be patient. God's working in her life, slowly but surely. Something else to notice is that whenever this famine struck, Naomi was concerned for her own survival. But in the very beginning of chapter 3, now she's only concerned about Ruth. She says, should I not try to find a home for you, where you will be provided for? Again, we're seeing growth here. We're seeing God's hand work in her life. And so, as I try to wrap this up briefly here, let me go back to that old movie I started with, Casablanca, back in the 1940s. It has a lot of very famous lines in there. Play it, Sam. You know, he tells the piano player, play the song that she wants. Or, here's looking at you, kid. Everyone knows that one. And maybe you even heard, we'll always have Paris. All from that same movie. But there's a line that applies not only to Casablanca, but to the book of Ruth here. And at the very end of the movie, Humphrey Bogart says to Ingrid Bergman, he tells her, you need to leave, go with your husband. He says, I'm basically going to live my life without you, and vice versa. But he says, if you don't, he says, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and for the rest of your life. That's what Naomi was telling Ruth. She said, you're never going to know what happens between you and Boaz. You are risking great heartbreak. I know you are. But would you rather at least move on knowing that it would not work if it doesn't, rather than living your life just wondering? So you don't want to regret it. Hollywood has yet to produce a movie to that caliber. It's one of the greatest love stories ever, but really the greatest love story ever is what I want to close with you. close with you. It's also found cover to cover in the Bible. It is the story of a God who loves his people so much that he gives his son. That all they have to do is believe in him and put their faith in him. And then they will be saved. It's what John wrote about in that very popular John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth him shall not perish, but would have everlasting life. And so that's why I say we can all be included in this greatest love story ever just by putting our faith in Jesus Christ. It is my hope that everyone here has done that, and if not, I just told you what you need to do. Let us bow our heads now and close in prayer. God, we just thank you for the book of Ruth, for the love story included there. We can see how it is head and shoulders above all the rest. It stands apart from any story that man could write because this includes your hand, and we know that these are real people who had these real things happen to them, these real experiences. And you did it all for your purpose. We know that this chapter 4 still remains. We'll look at that next week. That's going to really clarify a lot of it. But for now, God, we're just thankful that we have you that we can walk with, and that you gave us your Son, Jesus Christ, that all we have to do is believe in him and then know that we are saved. And that's a beautiful and a wonderful thing. God, we ask your blessing upon each person here as we leave this place, that we would walk in your righteousness and avoid the temptations of the enemy and avoid sin. And we pray that you would allow us to return to this place a week from now and share with each other the good things that God has been doing in our lives. We thank you and praise you in his holy name. Amen.